"I wanted to take it with me," she admitted. "God knows I tried. But every night I see his face. I hear him crying. I can't carry it any longer." Who was Grandma talking about? Whose face does she see? What load was she carrying? This story is about your family's secret. Don't just pass through the story. Let the story pass through you. Before this story truly begins, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our top-notch, deeply moving tales. These are stories that stay with you long after the final word is spoken. It was not a peaceful silence, but a careful one, the kind that comes when walls have heard too much over too many years. The old Victorian house stood at the edge of town, its white paint peeling, its foundation holding the weight of generations who have learned to smile through discomfort and bury pain beneath tradition. The family had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, and longer than anyone dared to question. Margaret Holloway lay in the narrow bed by the window, her body frail, her breathing thin and uneven. Age had taken nearly everything from her: strength, beauty, certainty, but not her eyes. They remained sharp, restless, heavy with memory. They moved slowly around the room, as though revisiting moments that had never been spoken aloud. To the family, she was Grandma Margaret. To the past, she was the keeper of a truth too dangerous to survive daylight. In the corner of the room, sitting quietly on the floor, was a child. His name was Samuel Carter. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with eyes that observed far more than they revealed. He had learned early that asking questions only led to trouble. In the Carter family, silence was not just encouraged, it was inherited. He had been sent to stay with his grandmother because no one else wanted to. Death made the family uneasy. It demanded honesty, and honesty had never been their strength. So they assumed the child would remember nothing, that he was too young to matter. They were wrong. Margaret's gaze settled on Samuel, lingering. "Come here," she whispered. Samuel hesitated, then moved closer, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled tightly together. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She studied his face as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "You notice things," she said softly. "I don't talk about them." A faint smile touched her lips. "I know." Down the hallway, voices murmured. Arguments disguised as concern. Discussions about property, about wills, about who would sacrifice the most over the years. The same conversations, recycled endlessly. Margaret reached for Samuel's hand. Her grip was unexpectedly firm. "This family," she whispered, "was built on a lie." The words seemed to thicken the air. Samuel did not pull away. "Long before you were born," she continued, her voice trembling, "something happened that should have been faced, but wasn't. We hid it. We told ourselves time would erase it." Her eyes filled with tears. "Time doesn't erase anything. It only buries it deeper." She drew a shaky breath. "There was a child who was never meant to disappear, but did. His name was taken, his place stolen, and every generation after paid the price. Broken homes, unexplained tragedies, love that turned bitter without reason." Her grip tightened. "You weren't born by accident, Samuel." His heart began to race. "They think you're just another boy," she said, her voice urgent now, but you are the echo of what we erased. You carry what was stolen. You carry the truth none of us had the courage to confess." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I wanted to take it with me," she admitted. "God knows I tried, but every night I see his face, I hear him crying. I can't carry it any longer." Footsteps approached the door. Margaret's breathing grew shallow. "When the time comes," she whispered, "they'll blame you. They'll say you're tearing the family apart." Her eyes locked onto his. "But you'll be saving it." Samuel nodded, tears blurring his vision. "I promise," he whispered. Margaret exhaled, slow, final, relieved. By morning, she was gone. The family mourned loudly. They cried publicly. They praised her strength and wisdom. No one mentioned the child who had been alone with her in her final moments. And Samuel never spoke of what she told him. Not then. But secrets don't die when people do. They wait. Samuel grew into silence. The family mistook his quiet for obedience, his observant nature for innocence. They never imagined that inside him lived a confession older than most of them. Margaret was buried beneath the old oak tree behind the house, as tradition demanded. The elders said it was so her spirit could watch over them. Samuel avoided the tree afterward, circling wide whenever he passed it, as though the ground itself might speak. In the weeks after her death, the family began to unravel. Arguments sharpened, old resentments surfaced without warning. Aunts who had tolerated one another for decades stopped speaking altogether. Uncles accused each other of theft, betrayal, and long-forgotten slights. Samuel noticed something else. At night, he dreamed of places he had never been. A small room with no windows, a woman sobbing quietly, a man turning away in shame, and always a child, older than Samuel, but wearing his face, standing alone as a door closed. He woke with his chest tight, his pillow damp with tears he could not remember shedding. His mother, Elizabeth Carter, worried in the distant way survival forces upon people. She loved her son deeply, but fear shaped her love. "Don't talk too much," she often told him. "People twist words. Silence keeps you safe." Samuel learned to nod. At family gatherings, he watched closely. He saw how Uncle Richard stiffened whenever Margaret's name was mentioned, how Aunt Linda avoided old photographs, how his grandfather's portrait was never cleaned, never acknowledged. Once, when Samuel was 10, he asked why his grandmother never spoke about her first husband. The slap came quickly. Elizabeth froze afterward, staring at her own hand in horror. "Never ask that again," she whispered. "Some doors should stay closed." But the door Margaret had opened refused to shut. As Samuel grew older, the family's misfortunes grew louder. A cousin drowned in shallow water. Another fell ill without diagnosis. Businesses collapsed. Marriages disintegrated as if poisoned from within. The elders called it bad luck. Samuel knew better. At 15, he found the box, hidden in the ceiling of Margaret's old room, buried beneath dust and webs. Inside were letters, old, yellowed, written in hands heavy with fear and regret. They spoke of a forbidden pregnancy, a powerful man who chose reputation over responsibility, a baby taken away in the dead of night, his existence erased to preserve honor. One letter froze Samuel's breath. He must never know who he is. If the truth comes out, this family will not survive it. That night the dreams returned, clearer now, and Margaret's voice echoed in his mind. "You carry what was taken." At 17, Samuel began to change. Not outwardly, but something in his presence unsettled people. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Eyes avoided his.
That year, his grandfather died. On his deathbed, the old man mistook Samuel for someone else. "You came back," he whispered, terror widening his eyes. "I told them to forget you." Samuel said nothing. At the funeral, surrounded by grief and quiet fear, Samuel understood. He was not just a child born into the family. He was the truth they buried. And whether they were ready or not, the reckoning was coming.
After the funeral, the house changed. It wasn't anything anyone could point to. The walls didn't move. The floors didn't creak any louder than before. But something invisible had shifted, like a long-held breath finally released. The Carter house felt exposed, as though the truth, still unnamed, had begun to seep through the cracks. Samuel felt it most at night. He would lie awake listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the ticking clock in the hallway, the distant sound of cars passing on the main road. Sounds he had known his whole life now felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive, as if they were witnesses. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it carried him back into the same recurring dream. The room without windows. This time, the room was clearer. The walls were pale yellow, stained near the corners. A single mattress lay on the floor. The woman sat beside it, her back to him, shoulders shaking as she cried. He could see her hands now, young hands, trembling, clutching a folded blanket. "Please," she whispered, to no one in particular, "please don't take him." A shadow crossed the doorway. A man stood there, tall, well-dressed, his face turned just enough for Samuel to recognize the shape of his jaw, the familiar curve of his brow. The family resemblance struck him like a blow. The man did not speak. He only nodded once, sharply. The door closed. Samuel woke gasping, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might break through his chest. He sat up in bed, staring into the darkness, one truth settling heavily over him. These were not dreams. They were memories. Not his, but his inheritance. At school, Samuel praised him for being mature. Classmates found him distant, hard to read. He drifted through the hallways unnoticed, carrying something far older than his 17 years. He began visiting the town library after classes, drawn to dusty records and local archives. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for, only that it was there. One afternoon, buried in old town registries, he found a gap. A birth record had been altered, a name scratched out so faintly it almost escaped notice, a date that aligned too perfectly with the letters in the box. Samuel's hands trembled as he copied the information into a notebook. The erased name burned in his mind. He didn't confront anyone, not yet. At home, the family continued their slow collapse. Uncle Richard lost his job after an accusation surfaced, something from years ago, something he swore had been handled privately. Aunt Linda's marriage ended suddenly when her husband walked out without explanation. Elizabeth grew quieter, more withdrawn, snapping at Samuel for small things and then apologizing through tears. "I don't know what's happening," she confessed one night, sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. "It feels like everything is coming undone." Samuel watched her, his chest tight. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to lift the weight off both of them. But Granny's voice echoed in his mind. "They will not like you for it." So he waited. The breaking point came on a Sunday.
The family gathered in the living room after church, tension thick as humidity. An argument erupted over the house, who deserved it, who had invested the most, who had sacrificed their future for the family name. Voices rose, old accusations resurfaced. "You always thought you were better than us," Richard snapped at Elizabeth. "You've never taken responsibility for anything," she fired back. Samuel stood quietly near the doorway, watching the familiar chaos unfold. And suddenly, he realized something with terrifying clarity. They were fighting shadows. They were bleeding from a wound they had never been allowed to see. "Stop!" The word left Samuel's mouth before he could stop it. Every voice fell silent. They turned toward him, surprised, annoyed, dismissive. "This doesn't concern you," Richard said sharply. Samuel stepped forward. "It concerns all of us." Elizabeth stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time. "Samuel, what are you doing?" His heart hammered, but his voice remained steady. "Grandma Margaret told me the truth." The room shrank. No one laughed. No one spoke. "She told me what happened before any of you were born, about the child who was taken, about the lie this family was built on." Richard's face drained of color. Linda gripped the arm of the couch. "That's impossible," someone whispered. "I've seen the letters, the records. I know his name." Elizabeth stood abruptly, shaking her head. "No, no, you don't understand." "I do, and you did too. All of you did. You just chose not to look." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Then Richard laughed, short, broken, desperate. "You're a kid. You don't know what you're talking about." Samuel met his gaze. "He was your brother." The words landed like bodies hitting water. Elizabeth collapsed back into her chair. Tears streamed down Linda's face. "No, no, Mama promised. She promised she would never—" "She broke her promise," Samuel said gently, "because she knew the truth wouldn't survive another generation of silence." Elizabeth looked at her son, really looked at him, and something inside her shattered. "You're not just telling the story," she said, her voice barely audible. "You are the story." Samuel nodded. "I was born to finish it." The room filled with sobs, raw, uncontrollable. Years of denial poured out in broken sentences and half-confessions. Regret surfaced, guilt, fear, but beneath it all, something else emerged. Relief. For the first time, the truth had a voice. Later that night, Samuel stood alone in Granny's old room. Moonlight spilled across the floor. He reached up and touched the ceiling where the box had once been hidden. "I kept my promise," he whispered. Outside, the oak tree rustled softly in the wind. For the first time since her death, Samuel slept without dreams. And somewhere, deep within the family's long-buried history, the child who had been erased was finally seen. But truth, once revealed, does not end a story. It begins a new one. And the world beyond that house was about to learn what the Carter family had tried so hard to forget.
The days after Samuel spoke felt unreal, as if the house itself no longer trusted gravity. No one left, no one knew how. They moved through the rooms like strangers trapped together by a storm, avoiding one another's eyes, flinching at every sound. Doors closed softly, footsteps hesitated. The old house, once loud with arguments and forced laughter, became a place of whispers and unfinished thoughts. Elizabeth stopped sleeping. Samuel would hear her pacing late into the night, the soft creak of floorboards betraying her restlessness. Sometimes she stood in the doorway of his room, watching him breathe, as if afraid he might disappear the way the other child had. One night she finally spoke. "I knew," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed, her voice hollow. I was a teenager when I found out. Mama begged me not to ask questions. She said the family had already paid too much. Her hands shook. I thought if I ignored it, if I lived well enough, maybe it would stay buried. Samuel said nothing. You're not supposed to exist this way, Elizabeth continued, tears slipping down her face. You weren't meant to carry it. Samuel looked at her then, really looked at her, and understood something that softened the anger he hadn't known he was holding. None of them had been strong enough to carry the truth. So it had waited for someone who was. Outside the house, the truth began to leak. Families like the Carters didn't fall apart quietly. People noticed when long-standing relationships fractured overnight, when respected names were suddenly spoken with uncertainty. Rumors spread, first vague, then sharper. Someone talked. Someone always did. A distant relative came forward with questions, then another. The erased child began to take shape in public memory, not as a ghost, but as a person wronged. And with recognition came resistance. Uncle Richard refused to accept it. He grew louder, more defensive, insisting Samuel had poisoned the family with lies. He threatened legal action. He accused Samuel of manipulation, of seeking attention, of destroying everything they had worked to preserve. "What good does this do?" Richard shouted one evening, his voice breaking. "You think the truth fixes anything?" Samuel met his gaze calmly. "No," he said, "but silence destroys everything." The words followed Richard long after he left the room. The greatest cost, however, came quietly. Samuel began to feel the weight of being known. Teachers treated him differently once the whispers reached the school, some with sympathy, others with discomfort. Friends kept their distance, unsure how to act around someone who carried a story too heavy for casual conversation. He became visible in a way he had never been before, and visibility is a burden. One afternoon, Samuel returned to the oak tree behind the house. The ground beneath it was uneven, roots twisting like exposed veins. He sat there for a long time, tracing patterns in the dirt, listening to the wind move through the leaves. "I didn't erase you," he whispered, "but I will finish what they started." For the first time, the dreams changed. The room without windows faded. In its place stood an open door. The woman no longer cried. She stood tall, watching the child step forward into light. The man was gone, his shadow dissolved. The memory loosened its grip. Samuel woke with tears on his face, not from pain, but from release. The family never returned to what it had been. Some bonds were too damaged to survive the truth. Some members drifted away, choosing distance over accountability. Others stayed, changed forever, quieter but more honest. Elizabeth began therapy. She cried for years she couldn't reclaim. She apologized, not just to Samuel, but to the child who had never been allowed a voice. "I should have been braver," Elizabeth said once. Samuel shook his head. "You raised me to be." In time, Samuel told the story publicly, not as revenge, not as accusation, but as remembrance. He spoke carefully, respectfully, refusing to turn pain into spectacle. People listened. Some cried, some resisted, but many recognized themselves in the silence, in the fear, in the cost of pretending nothing happened. And slowly something extraordinary occurred. Other families began to speak. Stories surfaced of erased children, hidden truths, lives shaped by decisions made in the dark. Samuel received letters from strangers who thanked him for naming what they had never been allowed to say. He understood then what Granny had seen. He had not been born to expose a family. He had been born to break a pattern. Years later, Samuel returned once more to the old house before it was sold. He walked through each room,
touching the walls, acknowledging the pain held there. In Granny's room, he stood by the window and smiled softly. "You didn't die afraid," he whispered. "You died honest." Outside, the oak tree stood strong, its roots deep, its branches wide. The past had not been erased, but it no longer owned them. And somewhere, in the long arc of memory and blood, a child who had once been denied his name finally had it restored, not in ink, not in records, but in truth. Some stories are told to entertain, others are told to heal. This one was told because it had waited long enough.
Years later, when the house no longer belonged to the Carter name and strangers walked its halls without knowing what had been paid for those walls, Samuel returned one last time. The real estate sign had already been taken down. The windows were empty now, stripped of curtains, stripped of memory, at least on the surface. The air inside smelled different, cleaner, as if the house had tried to forget itself. But houses never forget. Samuel moved through the rooms without turning on the lights. He didn't need to see. Every step landed exactly where it always had, as if the floor remembered his weight. He paused in the living room, where voices had once risen in anger and grief, where truth had finally been spoken aloud. Silence met him there, not the heavy silence of denial, but the quiet that follows confession. He climbed the stairs slowly, his hand brushing the railing worn smooth by generations of hands that had held on while refusing to let go of the past. At the end of the hallway, he stopped. Margaret's room. The door was open. Moonlight spilled across the floor in the same pale stripe it had all those years ago. The bed was gone, the furniture removed, but the room felt occupied, as if something still lingered, patient and watchful. Samuel stepped inside. He stood by the window and looked out at the yard. The oak tree remained, taller now, its branches stretching wide, roots pressing deeper into the earth. Beneath it, the ground lay undisturbed, but Samuel knew better. "Your name didn't survive on paper," he said quietly, "but it survived in me." The room was still. Then, softly, the air shifted. Not a sound, not a voice, a feeling, the same feeling he had known as a child, sitting on the edge of the bed while an old woman finally let go of her fear. Samuel closed his eyes. "I carried it," he whispered, "like you asked." Images passed through him, not like memories, but like acknowledgments. The erased child stepping into light, the woman standing tall, the closed door opening at last. When Samuel opened his eyes, the weight was gone, not lifted suddenly, not erased, but laid to rest. He turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. For just a moment, he thought he heard breathing, not labored, not frightened, but calm, at peace. He didn't look back. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree, leaves whispering in a language older than words. Samuel walked away, his footsteps steady, unburdened. Behind him, the house stood silent. But for the first time in its long history, it was no longer guarding a secret. It was only a house. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond shame, beyond silence, a child who had once been denied his place finally belonged. The truth had been spoken. The debt had been paid, and the past, at last, let go.
Years later, when the house no longer belonged to the Carter name and strangers walked its halls without knowing what had been paid for those walls, Samuel returned one last time. The real estate sign had already been taken down. The windows were empty now, stripped of curtains, stripped of memory, at least on the surface. The air inside smelled different, cleaner, as if the house had tried to forget itself. But houses never forget. Samuel moved through the rooms without turning on the lights. He didn't need to see. Every step landed exactly where it always had, as if the floor remembered his weight. He paused in the living room where voices had once risen in anger and grief, where truth had finally been spoken aloud. Silence met him there. Not the heavy silence of denial, but the quiet that follows confession. He climbed the stairs slowly, his hand brushing the railing worn smooth by generations of hands that had held on while refusing to let go of the past. At the end of the hallway, he stopped. Margaret's room. The door was open. Moonlight spilled across the floor in the same pale stripe it had all those years ago. The bed was gone, the furniture removed, but the room felt occupied, as if something still lingered, patient and watchful. Samuel stepped inside. He stood by the window and looked out at the yard. The oak tree remained, taller now, its branches stretching wide, roots pressing deeper into the earth. Beneath it, the ground lay undisturbed, but Samuel knew better. "Your name didn't survive on paper," he said quietly, "but it survived in me." The room was still. Then, softly, the air shifted. Not a sound, not a voice, a feeling. The same feeling he had known as a child, sitting on the edge of the bed while an old woman finally let go of her fear. Samuel closed his eyes. "I carried it," he whispered, "like you asked." Images passed through him, not like memories, but like acknowledgments. The erased child stepping into light, the woman standing tall, the closed door opening at last. When Samuel opened his eyes, the weight was gone. Not lifted suddenly, not erased, but laid to rest. He turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused. For just a moment, he thought he heard breathing, not labored, not frightened, but calm, at peace. He didn't look back. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree, leaves whispering in a language older than words. Samuel walked away, his footsteps steady, unburdened. Behind him, the house stood silent, but for the first time in its long history, it was no longer guarding a secret. It was only a house. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond shame, beyond silence, a child who had once been denied his place finally belonged. The truth had been spoken, the debt had been paid, and the past, at last, let go.